Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Happy Hour WhiskyCast webcast. It's one of those days, guys. Lots of storms today, lots of technical issues, but we're going to have a lot of fun over the next hour. So if you have questions about whiskey history, we have two of the experts, both Scotch whiskey and bourbon history. Mike Veach is a member of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame and a world-class historian when it comes to talking about bourbons. And we also have the one and only Charlie MacLean, who's written a whole bunch of books on whiskey, especially Scotch whiskey, but whiskeys from all over the world, and has been doing a lot of writing while in lockdown. We'll talk to them in just a minute, and you can start bringing in your questions in the chat rooms on Facebook and on YouTube. If you're watching on Periscope, you can send your questions in as well. But if you are watching on Twitter, don't do anything right away because we will not have the ability to see your comments until after the show. Right now, I want to bring in Conor Dempsey, our buddy from Writers Tears. And Conor, tell me basically let's talk about this auction raffle rather, that you guys did that ended up yesterday for the Jack and Jill Foundation in Ireland.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I'm here representing Bernard Walsh, who himself and his wife Rosemary, it's their 22nd wedding anniversary today. So that's why you have me as a replacement. But yes, about it just a little over a month ago, given COVID and everything, charities are one of the most affected sectors. And the Jack and Jill Foundation is a 23-year-old charity that supports 340 families in Ireland here of children who are up to the age of 5 years of age with very complex medical conditions, very uncertain outcomes. And the charity really supports them with specialized nursing care to give the child support and to give the family that respite that they can. So they provide them with respite care 20 to 40 hours approximately per week. And really, we just sort of made a commitment to raise enough money to give them 1,000 nursing hours of support. And we put the call out to the Walsh Whisky community. We offered Bernard and Rosemary's own personal collection of all of the Writers Tears Cask Strength vintages that have been released to date, which number 9. And then with this year's vintage, which will be bottled in a couple of months' time, that brings it to 10. So 10 bottles of Writers Tears Cask Strength, all the vintages. And we were flabbergasted. We thought there might be a number of projects to get to the target of 1,000 hours. And thankfully, through the generosity of the community, including folk here from WhiskyCast community, we got to the 1,000 hours just yesterday. So delighted to be able to present a check for €16,000, $18,000 to the Jack and Jill Foundation.
And let's talk about the winner. Who won the award? Who won the whiskeys? Because you had the drawing yesterday on your Facebook page live.
Yes, we did. It was a gentleman and from Ireland. No fix here. It was a gentleman called Liam Boland from Dingle, which is in County Kerry on the southwest of Ireland, and the Dingle Peninsula, one of the most scenic, and has become famous in recent years for hosting one of the venues for one of the latest Star Wars movies. It's the most westerly tip of Europe is the Dingle Peninsula. So Liam Boland from Dingle was the winner drawn last night.
Well, congratulations to Liam. I hope you enjoy those whiskeys. As I think I'd said on social media, we bought a ticket or two, and had we won, we would have donated them through Celtic Whiskey Auctions to be auctioned off to raise some more money for the Jack and Jill Foundation. We put
if you told us that before, Mark, we could have done something. Well, but no, much appreciated.
We had to play it straight, of course. But there is a picture on the screen right now, the Jack and Jill Foundation at jackandjill.ie in Ireland, if you want to find out more about them. And Conor, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and please give Bernard and Rosemary our best wishes on their anniversary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for your support. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Good evening.
Thank you for Conor for joining us, and it's now time to bring in our guests. Well, let's talk to Charlie MacLean and Mike Veach. Gentlemen, good evening. How are you today?
A bit weary. It's 10 o'clock at night here in Edinburgh.
10 o'clock at night in Edinburgh, but for some people, that's just getting started time.
I'm usually in my bed by 9:30. I get up very early in the day, and I'm best in the morning.
Mike, we are having a little trouble seeing you. Can you tilt your camera down just a little bit, please?
Is that better?
No, Charlie, you're fine. Mike? Yes, please tilt your camera down a little. There we go, so we can see you. Otherwise, you're kind of cut off there. How are you tonight, Mike?
I'm having trouble hearing you.
You're having trouble hearing us. Oh, lovely. We're having problems with the audio again. Just how about now? Does that work a little better?
It's still a little fuzzy.
Okay, but you can't hear us, right? If you move a little closer to your
internet.
What? If you can scoot in a little closer. There, how about now? Is that better? Okay.
I hear you now.
Oh, okay, and we can hear and see you. So we have questions already coming in right now. But gentlemen, first of all, what's in your glasses tonight? What are you drinking? Go ahead, Charlie. What do you got?
Well, I've got several drinks in front of me. The first is a blend that I put together, which I tasted actually. My boys, as you know, Mark, rode the Atlantic recently, earlier this year. And prior to that, as a practice run, they rode up the west coast of Scotland. And all the distilleries on the west coast donated bottles for the charity which they're supporting, which is called Feedback Madagascar, and exists to dig wells for the poor people in Madagascar, a very, very poor country. So I put it together as a blend, a vat of malt, and this afternoon I spent, signing labels, actually. You can see this, it's a gorgeous label for this. And I tasted the blend for the first time. I tasted obviously prior, it was returned to cask, obviously to marry. And but so the first time I tasted the finished product was this afternoon. And, actually I've drunk quite a lot of it this evening. Sort of justifying, it's come out as a very good dram. So that's what I'm drinking first, and then I'm going to go on to a couple of malts later on when the discussion gets really intense.
Mike, what have you got in your glass?
I have some Old 55 single barrel. Old 55 is a small distillery that just started up in northern Indiana. Jason Fruits, the distiller there, is making some really interesting whiskey. This is nothing but corn and wheat. He's not using any barley. He's using artificial enzymes to make his whiskey, so it's very strong in the corn flavors, very very sweet and very very nice.
Sounds interesting. I haven't tried that one yet. I am doing a little experiment tonight because a few weeks ago, Balcones in Texas released their Texas Bock whiskey, a straight malt whiskey that they did in collaboration with Spetzel Distillery in Shiner, Texas, that makes the legendary Shiner Bock beer, which I also happen to have a bottle of. And what they did with this was make it from the exact same mash bill and recipe that Spetzel uses for Shiner Bock beer, right down to the special lagering yeast. And it's a 2-year-old, but it's one of those whiskeys where you get a chance to actually taste the beer that it came from along with the whiskey. Essentially, they made it in there. They went and mashed it at the distillery the same way that they would have done it at the brewery, except that before you go on to the brewing part of the process, you take it to the stills. And I thought it was interesting. So it's a chance to double dip a little bit and see the comparisons, and you can tell the difference, the similarities right away. They didn't take a lot out of that. I'm sorry, Charlie?
No, very interesting experiment. Yeah.
So I'll write up something about that later on for the website, but we already have questions coming in, and we'll start with you, Charlie. This question comes in from Chris Ratcliffe. Why did the whiskey regions of Scotland emerge the way they did, and why did certain styles take hold in certain areas through regional expertise. And are the Scotch whiskey regions still relevant today, given that you can make pretty much any kind of malt whiskey anywhere within Scotland now?
Very good question, Chris. The first whiskey region was simply a division between Lowland and Highland for tax purposes, and that was introduced in 1785, and it was simply a fiscal measure, really. But there were different regulations applied above what they called the Highland line and below the Highland line. The larger distilleries below the Highland line, the Lowland distilleries, they had different regulations, and they were more industrial. Above the Highland line, the stills were smaller and allowed to be smaller, and the mash was entirely malted barley. So as time went on, the grain whiskey tended to be produced down below the Highland line in the lowlands, whereas malt whiskey became the product of the Highlands. By the late 19th century, well, let's say the mid-19th century, post 1860, when mixing of the two styles became popular, then other regions were discerned, other styles were discerned for blending purposes. Notably Campbelltown, which actually produced a very variable style of whiskey, malt whiskey. Lowland, so we had Lowland, Highland, and then Campbelltown, and then you had Islay whiskies, which were discerned fairly early on as being a separate style. And then by the 1890s, Speyside, a lot of building on Speyside producing generally speaking, a lighter style of whiskey, sweeter, more estery, more fruity, which was very desirable from a blender's perspective. And so, but actually Speyside was not acknowledged as being a separate region really until, well, I would say about 1990. It was acknowledged as such, but it was not defined. So the legal definition now admits these 5 regions: Speyside, Highland, Lowland, Campbelltown, and Islay. Now, as you rightly say, nowadays the understanding of flavour allows. I mean, the most obvious characteristic is peated, smoky whiskies, which you can make anywhere. You know, if you peat your malt, you'll make a smoky whiskey, a smoky style whiskey. It has to be said that depending upon where the peat comes from, Island peat is different from Islay peat, and it's different from Speyside peat or from Orkney peat and so on. Well, for Orkney's Island, obviously, but so you get different styles of peat, but you can make a broadly similar character of whiskey. And so it really began to be exploited, the idea of regional differences, and promoted in the same way that people familiar with wine regions in France, they could understand this. And so consumers, and indeed publishers, in the 1980s, began to. So the regional differences, what I'm saying, the regional differences were acknowledged by blenders, but they weren't communicated to consumers at all until the late 1980s. And then they were adopted as a convenient way of encouraging people to explore and to realize that the malts from one region were subtly different from another region. And so that was why the whole business of regional differences became popular. And it was a very justifiable way of introducing people to malt whiskey. The view of the industry at the moment is that they're trying to get it, because as you rightly say, again, because you can make, there's no distinctive style. My dear friend and colleague Dave Broom talks about There is some talk about terroir. Is the terroir in malt whiskey distilling? Answer: no, frankly. Although that's debated by Mark Rainier, it's one of these lovely lacunae that it may be or may not be. But generally speaking, the industry's view is that there's no terroir. Dave talks about cultural terroir. And so within one region or another, for very traditional reasons, the fact that they've been doing it one way, one distillery to another, they've been doing it that way for many, many years. So they've established a character for that distillery and indeed within that region. And so that it is still possible to discern characteristics. I mean, we know that on Islay, not all the 8 distilleries produce a smoky style of whiskey, although Islay whiskey is famously smoky. On Speyside, you can produce light Speysides, you can produce heavy Speysides, you can produce medium weight Speysides. And the industry would prefer to move away from regional differences now, and to encourage people to go and make up their own mind and to discern by flavor alone, by nose and taste. But it's an interesting topic. It's a useful way of exploring malt whiskey, but not an infallible way by any means.
Is there still value? Graham Fraser is asking that question, or is it basically just a semantic difference right now, unless you're talking about Islay compared to the Scottish mainland?
Yeah, it is. It is a semantic difference, but it's still valid actually, because the whiskies from, but it's not set in stone. That's that and particularly in Highland region. I mean, you get these wide range of flavors, styles. The West Coast distilleries tend to be slightly sort of maritime, but then Pulteney up north is maritime. A huge range of heavy and medium and lightweight whiskies. One of the distinguishing features of Highland malt whiskies, including Speyside, by the way, was the use of peat in kilning. I mean, even in the 1890s, they were drying their malt over peat, except for 2 distilleries, Glengrant and Strathisla, which used a mix of peat and what they called silent coal, which was coke actually. And but if you run your kiln very hot, you don't necessarily have a very smoky whiskey, and so you can produce a very, very lightly peated style, but nevertheless drying the malt over peat. So the styles exist, and for traditional reasons. I mean, the rash of new distilleries that have opened recently, wherever they are, they can choose, and many of them are making 2 styles, peated and non-peated. Ardnamurchan Distillery, for example, very slightly peated and heavily peated. So it's not infallible, but it's nevertheless it's a useful guide. It's not entirely just semantic.
And our pal Bill Ricker in Boston says, greetings to Charlie Mack from Bill in Boston. Bill is the custodian of your late friend Mike Pedlipski's whiskey notes.
Oh, right. Hey, Bill.
And my collection, too.
Gosh, yeah, that would be interesting.
And Christopher Whalen says, hello to Michael. Have enjoyed reading your book, Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey and American Heritage. So, Mike, let's just start off real quickly here. Who made bourbon first?
What a good question.
Oh, that's a question.
I'm just starting trouble tonight.
No one really knows, and you're not going to know. There just wasn't that much written records in the early days, and nobody really. If you read my book, bourbon wasn't created necessarily by one person. It was evolution. It was a way to sell Kentucky whiskey to the French down in New Orleans by making it taste more like French brandy. Who did it first? We really don't know. Nobody's made the claim at the time, and we haven't found any written records that really prove it one way or another. So, yeah.
But we do know who made rye whiskey first in the U.S., right?
Yes, there's I should have brought my notes with me, but there was a guy in 1648 that made rye up in New York in the Dutch colonies. So yeah, rye whiskey has been around for a long time. As American distilling. The first American distilling was once again somebody on Staten Island that was making brandy in 1640. So we have a heritage of distilling that's very rich and just as rich in many ways as what's in Scotland or Ireland or elsewhere.
Chris Ratcliffe has a question for you, Michael. How much bourbon history is written or co-opted by brands? And we're going to get on a little bit of a controversial point here. What are the biggest or most common misconceptions out there? I think there are those who would argue the theory that Evan Williams was the first distiller in Kentucky is probably a misconception, although we can't prove anything from back then, but the records don't exist. But what other misconceptions are out there?
Oh, there's a lot of well, we'll be polite and say they're misconceptions. I often refer to them as market history, what the marketing departments make up to sell their whiskey, and that's nothing new. That's been going on for 150 years or more. As distillers would stretch the truth in order to sell their whiskey. And I'm sure it's true not just in the United States, but anybody that whiskey, whether it's Scotland, Japan, Ireland, wherever.
They stretch the truth about whiskey's origins? Heaven forbid.
But there's a lot of
myth-making. Yeah. Mike, can I throw in a question? When were the mash bills defined for rye and malt and bourbon? That you had to have 51%
the mash
corn
bills.
or 50% rye.
At the Philson Historical Society, we've got recipes, which are basically mash bills for whiskeys going back to the 1790s. And they generally are corn, rye or wheat, and malted barley. They've been around, corn has been the predominant thing because that's what they grow in Kentucky. Ova Haney from Four Roses once was asked that question, why bourbon made out of corn? And he says that's because of what they grew here. If we grew rice, it'd been made out of rice. But,
yeah.
And I'm sure that's true in Scotland too. The reason it's made out of malt is because that's what they grow there. We've got a huge influence from Germany. A lot of earlier Germans, and that's one reason I think we use so much rye to start with, is because I think that was what they were distilling in Germany, and they brought that over here with us. They were growing rye in Pennsylvania and New York and elsewhere, and even in Kentucky, they put a little rye in with their corn to make the corn whiskey.
Mike, a question for you. Go ahead, Charlie. Go ahead. Charlie, go ahead. Did you have something else? Go ahead.
No. I'm having difficulty. You're breaking up a little bit.
Okay.
No, I've got nothing else to say about that. Very, very interesting.
Mike, let me ask you real quickly here, because we've had a lot of discussion about the culture in America, especially where it refers to African Americans and people of color over the last few weeks and then going back. Can you give us any ideas of just how extensive the slave trade was involved in bourbon making back in Kentucky and Tennessee? We know about Tennessee and folks like Nearest Green and people like that, but how extensive was it in Kentucky before the Civil War? Do you know offhand?
It's going to be a lot more extensive than we know. Unfortunately, the records of the time, they didn't consider slaves people, and they don't write down slave did something. you know, for example, there's a distillery records at the Filson from the 1840s, and they have slaves, and they're renting the slaves. They don't give the name of the slaves at all. They don't say what they're renting them out to do, or anything. So that type of record is just really hard to come by. It's dependent upon what type of records the slave owning family distillers kept, and do they still survive even. A lot of slave records were destroyed after the Civil War because people didn't want their family to be associated with it.
Do we know of any modern day brands that still have a link to the slave pasts? I know most of the brands that are around today came about after Prohibition ended, but there are still some that presumably have at least some ties.
There's got to be some ties. There were a lot of families out there that were owning slaves. A lot of them weren't, even if they didn't own slaves, a lot of them would be renting the labor, the skilled labor, slave labor from people who did.
Yeah.
I got a feeling that there's just as many slaves that were involved in making barrels as there was making whiskey. Still a very important part of the industry. It's something I wish I knew more about, but it's hard to find that information. And I've looked all through the Filson's records, which are very extensive. I've glanced through University of Kentucky and Kentucky Historical Society. There just isn't anything that I can find at this point.
Yeah, you would think that with the Beam family celebrating 225 years this year of Jacob Beam making his first whiskey, you might have thought that there might be some connections there, but I couldn't find any in the research I was able to do. And from what I understand, Jacob and then his son David Beam both had so many kids that they maybe didn't need slave labor because they had something like 16 kids between them or something like that.
Yeah. They didn't, as far as I know, they didn't own slaves. And so that would be the most common use of slaves, is distillers own slaves. But with that many kids, did they have the money to rent slaves? Like you said, did they need it? So it's a complex story.
And just to point out the Scotch whiskey connection, University College in London went back and released its archives because it had access to the British government's archives of UK residents or residents of England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland at the time who received compensation for slaves when the UK outlawed slaveholding. And that was done before the Civil War in the US. And I specifically asked the researchers that had been going through there, and they were not able to find any links to whiskey in any of those, to Scotch whiskey in any of those. And I think it would have been more likely to be connected to the rum trade than it would have been Scotch whiskey back then. But just to clarify that, just to move on, a question for you, Charlie, from Tyrone Coty in Nova Scotia. He's just reading an old Alfred Barnard periodical and wants to know if there is any particular closed distillery in Campbelltown that you wished had survived.
Survived, yeah. Well, shortly before Christmas this year, last year, a very old friend of mine, a university friend, and his brother came up to visit me, and the brother had a small collection of whiskies, but they were high quality whiskies, which he was going to put up for auction. He brought them up to Edinburgh to put them into Bourbons for sale. One of them was a Ratcliffe. Now, Ratcliffe distillery closed terminally in 1930. This Ratcliffe was made in 1896, as I recall. And he wanted to take, it's the only known bottle of Ratcliffe. And I spoke to a number of people in the auction business, Martin Green, for example, at Bourbons. Have you ever come across a bottle of Ratcliffe? And he said, no. He said, do you know, I once saw one when I was working for Christie's, he says. And it was the only one I've ever seen, you know. So it was known, but never. And so I'm very unlikely to have been a fake. Very unlikely to have been a fake. So he set it up, or before he brought it up here, he set it up on his kitchen table on a pile of books to take a photograph of it before he brought it up for sale. And the bloody bottle fell off and smashed. And he scraped up a tiny drop and he put it into a very small bottle. I'll fetch the little bottle, I'll show it to you in a moment. But he had a picture of the label. And he gave me this. It would be about 4 cls. You know, it was a very, very small amount. And not long after that, I was asked to appear in a little film. And the theme of the film was the whiskey you never opened, you know. And so I hadn't opened this. It was a little spring cap bottle. But I said, I'm going to open it now. And I told them on camera, I told them the story. And then I opened it and I tasted it. And it was absolutely amazing. It was incredible, incredibly floral. You know, you'd think that Campbelltown whiskies, you know, typically are kind of maritime and maybe a bit smoky. And this was an elegant whiskey. So I think the short answer is that I'm sure that not many Ratcliffes would have been as good as that, but Ratcliffe would be one that I'd like to see return. I would also say, I mean, the Loch Lomond distillers who own Glen Scotia have done a fantastic job with Glen Scotia, both in terms of the distillery itself and with the products. They're producing some wonderful whiskies from Glen Scotia now. And it does rather surprise me. So you've now got Springbank, obviously, and of course Springbank, old Springbank is unbelievably good, you know. Springbank, Glen Scotia, Glengyle, which is owned by the people who own Springbank, and if I which I'm certainly not, and wouldn't advise anybody to, but if I was looking for somewhere to open a distillery, I would go to Campbelltown because it has this resounding reputation, historical reputation, and it really is on the up. It's a charming. Well, you know, Mark, it's now a charming little town. It was a pretty seedy old place, you know, until relatively recently, but it's got an awful lot going, and they've got a great pride and understanding. And there are numerous semi-derelict buildings, old distilleries, in the town. And so if you could buy a site and set up a distillery, you could import, if you like, the heritage of that particular distillery. But no, it's a very interesting question. The trouble is that, of course, nobody really knows. Most of the distilleries were closed by, well, I mean, Ratcliffe was the last, and then after that there was only the two, Springbank and Glen Scotia, after 1930. So nobody really knows what they really tasted like. The Speyside distillers called them stinking fish, and they accused them of filling into herring barrels, because it's a great fishing port, of course, Campbelltown, and they were damned. And then, of course, they were also supposed to have shipped inferior product to America during Prohibition, whereas the Scotch distillers, the hardcore, the main companies, with their so-called secret agreement, made sure that the grog coming into America was good quality, the right price, and don't, as far as you possibly can, don't deal with the mob, you know, and so sowed the seeds during Prohibition of the phenomenal Scotch whisky in the US, you know, when it was repealed after 1933, you know. But by that time, Campbelltown was dead, alas.
Didn't the Scotch Whisky Association almost do away with Campbelltown as a whiskey region maybe 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, they were, yeah, they were going to, because it was, I mean, it was considered to be, at one time there was something like 27 distilleries in Campbelltown, and in the late 19th century, and I think when Barnard, there was 27 distilleries, but they began to decline after 1900, and then there were a handful open in the early 20s, but then they all went during the 20s, and so by the time, as you say, by the time the regulations were being redrawn, there was only the two. There was only Springbank and Glen Scotia, and so why should it keep its territorial designation? You know, why should it be considered to be a region? And but it was because it was traditionally an acknowledged region, you know, and so that's the reason. But you're right; it was within a whisker of being scratched, you know.
And Headley Wright said, no, that's not happening.
Have they brought? Sorry, Mark.
Pardon?
Have they brought? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Headley Wright of Springbank from J&A Mitchell. Headley Wright had basically said, no, you're not getting rid of Campbellton as a whiskey region.
Sure. He's a very cantankerous man and would have argued vigorously.
We have a question for Michael from Charlie Prince. Four Roses, in its origin story, makes no mention of Rufus Rose having founded it with his sibling and two children, hence Four Roses, instead opting for the marriage and proposal story that we've all heard over the years. What do you make of that, and how is it received in the market by fans? Michael?
You know, I miss Al Young. God rest his soul. He called me up one time when he was working on his book and just says, so where did Four Roses get its name? And the fact is, no one really knows in the company because there are no written records. There are stories, oral histories. I've yet to see any written records talking about the Rose Distillery and the Rose family. But I have a theory that it's probably was the Rose family that was making the whiskey, and they were probably making four different types of whiskey to go into it. That's the Four Roses, and that Paul Jones, when he started up, that was his major brand. He was what we would call a distributor. But when Prohibition shut the distillery down, Paul Jones bought the brand and took it with him to Kentucky. And this is one reason why there's a discrepancy. If you look in the old Midas Criteria trademark registration, it traces the trademark back to like 1869. But Four Roses only does it like in 1886 or whatever. And I think that's because that's exactly what happened. The brand was created by the Rose Distillery. Paul Jones was the major distributor. When the distillery was forced out by Prohibition in Georgia in the 1880s, Paul Jones moved to Kentucky, but he bought the trademark from the family who didn't want to move, stayed in Georgia, and brought the brand to Kentucky, and that's where they're tracing their trademark now. The brand is actually, 15, 20 years older than what the Four Roses says it is.
Another case where the marketing department writes the story and the history has to fit around it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Charlie, is there an example of where that's happened in Scotland?
I'm sorry?
Is there an example of where that's happened in Scotland where the facts don't quite jibe with the story?
Oh, gosh. I mean, we're great in the Irish, American, Scotch in reinventing our past. I mean, right from Hague. Hague, of course, always claimed to be the first distiller because on the grounds that, a Hague been done for illicit distilling in 1624 and arraigned in the church for breaking the Sabbath and making whiskey, perfectly legally, of course, but making whiskey on the Sabbath. And on that grounds, they claim to be, the oldest. The Dewars ran a massive campaign. The drink of your ancestors, ran from it was from about 1900 and into the 20s, and certainly into the 20s. Very, very successful campaign. Drink of your ancestors, and this so it's like the old Victorian parvenus, newcomers, new men made good, and then they try and attach pedigree to their family. It happens all the time. There's a wonderful story about James Buchanan, who created black and white whiskey, and he was made a lord by Lord George in 1919. Lord George, who was the prime minister at the time, he was known to be taking donations to the Liberal Party, and Buchanan, he had done a lot of good war service, not active service, but in terms of supporting the cause during the First World War, and but anyway, he also bunged the Liberal Party £2,000, and so James Buchanan signed the cheque for £2,000, having agreed that the title he would take would be Lord Woollavington, and he signed the cheque Woollavington, so that it couldn't be cashed until he'd got his title. I mean, the Tommy Dewar, the two Dewar brothers both became peers. So the creating or inventing heritage goes back an awful long way. It's all to do with respectability and marketing. Yeah.
So, Charlie, what have you switched to in your glass now? Because we've had people asking what we're still drinking. So, what have you switched to after the pillage?
Well, I've got a choice. Here. I'm so privileged to be asked to write tasting notes on single casks from various companies, and the one I'm going to look at now is from Diageo. I don't know if you can see it. It's a Brora 1978, which is in. Oh, that's better. I did the wrong way, of course. But it's a Brora 1978 in their program called Casks of Distinction. The Cask of Distinction is a single cask sales program, and I have tasted this before, and it was oh gosh, there's plenty left. That's brilliant. So here we have it. Look at that. Gorgeous color, good beading. You may not be. Oh yeah, you can see the little bubbles. Oh God, you can see the bubbles. Very good beading. That's a good sign. A very good sign. The strength is just cask strength. We don't know the strength. Oh, this is unbelievable. It's classic Brora, so it's very slightly sackcloth and very, very slightly smoky and waxy. Characteristic of Clynelish and Brora. Maritime, deep, rich. Slight nose feel, so it's got a bit of alcohol. It's not too low strength, thank goodness. There are floral notes, kind of moorland notes. I always think of with Clynelish certainly for bog myrtle, but you may not know about bog myrtle. It's a kind of perfumed flower, a perfumed leaf.
Charlie, you're inspiring a lot of jealousy among the audience out there.
Absolutely gorgeous. Oh, candle wax, teeth coating, gorgeous. And then there's a sort of tablet toffee in the mid palate, and then the smoke. A little bit of smoke comes in the end. Long, warming finish. I'm so glad to be able to share it with you.
Share it virtually
At
with
least
us. Yeah.
verbally with you.
And Mike stepped away for a second. Dave Kuhn was saying, Shiner Bock beer, Mark? And I'm going, yes, that's because if you joined us late, I pulled a bottle of Shiner Bock out because I have the Balcones Texas Bock whiskey that was made with the same mash bill, right down to the same grains from the same suppliers as a straight malt distilled at Balcones that Spetzel Brewery uses for Shiner Bock. So it's a chance to taste the two head to head. So that's why I'm drinking a beer tonight instead of my normal single malt. Mike, what have you got in your glass this time? I suspect you stepped away to go pull something really cool off the shelf.
Well, this is a whiskey that Bill Thomas and I had contract distilled down at Kentucky Artisan Distiller.
Oh, I know about
This
this.
is this is a whiskey that's 65% plain white corn, 20% rye, 12% regular distiller's malt, and 3% chocolate malt. 2 years old and very nice. And 2 years old, I mean, it's still got some nice color going to it. I can't wait till October when we go taste it again.
Question for you, Mike, from Chris Ratcliffe. How new is the innovation that we're seeing now in American whiskey? Has bourbon and rye been little changed for decades? And how would the new whiskeys today, like this Balcones straight malt that I'm tasting, how would these have been thought of historically by the early distillers?
Well, you know, the whiskey has changed. It's evolved over the years. There's been a lot of things that have happened. I always used to laugh every time I heard the Jim Beam story saying we're making it just like we did 200 years ago. And I'm saying, okay, well, let me see your pot still and non-hybrid grain, you know. Things have changed, even in the process. In the 19th century, barrel entry proofs, whiskey was going into the barrel anywhere from 90 to 105 proof because that was the proof people would drink it at. And since they were buying their whiskey right out of the barrel because bottles were expensive, distillers put it in the barrel at a proof that people could drink. This goes all the way up through Prohibition. When Prohibition ended, they actually put a maximum barrel proof on whiskey, straight whiskey, and it was 110. And that stayed that way up until 1964 when they raised it to 125. So, you know, there's just been a lot of subtle changes in the flavors and the processes and such. A lot of them are for the better, but not necessarily all of them. I think, you know, the lower barrel entry proof, maybe even a little lower, little lower yield might give you a little more flavor, you know, and make your whiskey better, make people wanting to pay more for it because it is better. So it may cost you a little bit more to lower your yield a little, but still, you know, so there's a lot of things that have changed.
Charlie, we have a question.
It's a very good question.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Can I come in there? It's a very good question. You know, how has flavor changed and how has it changed? There's no doubt it has changed. But it's been driven. Well, it's been driven by ultimately by either by perceived consumer demand, changing tastes, or by real consumer changes in taste. Now, for example, we can go right back to the 19th century, late 19th century, when Speyside came about. The blenders were the customers for the malt whiskey. You know, 99.9% of the malt whiskey made in these days was sold to the blenders. The whole gearing of their production, annual production, was for filling orders. And why Speyside appeals? Because they weren't quite so smoky, and there's no doubt that the English palate didn't enjoy obvious smokiness. And so the blends that were developed in those days from the 1880s were much lighter in style, much heavier actually than today, but lighter in style than the previous generation of blended Scotch, which was much smoother. So that was driven by consumer, by popular taste, if you like, accessibility. And so the production was geared to cope with that and supply the style of spirit that the consumers wanted. Luke Timmermans, good Lord. Well, this is great. I need to watch what I'm saying. I can see the interesting enough, during Prohibition and post-Prohibition blended Scotch, I'm thinking particularly of Cutty Sark and of J&B. Cutty Sark, obviously, during Prohibition was introduced, and J&B very soon after. Light style, and it was perceived that the American palate liked light style Scotches. Now, whether that was right or wrong, it's very confusing. But Mike, you may be able to help me because they liked a light color of whiskey, seemingly, and these certainly were developed being light color, and then others that followed on and took it. Chivas wouldn't recover actually, but anyway so the original flavor to whatever original was will no doubt have been different from so they evolve, and as you rightly say, Mike, for good or bad. Those of us like Mr. Timmons, who sent his time, those of us who've been able to taste old whiskies from different decades, whether they're blends or single malts, or I'm sure bourbons. I'm ignorant of bourbon. They are different. And in blind tastings, sadly, I have a couple of friends, and we have a little group called Now and Then, and we put up, we'll have a theme, like let's say sherried Speysides, and we'll come up with some of the guys, and a couple of the guys who are involved in this are involved in trading old whiskies, buying and selling at auction, and surplus. Some of the bottles that they have surplus for their requirements, they'll put up to create this. So they'll have a whiskey, a sherry style Speyside in this case, from the 1960s, let's say, even 1970s, and then its contemporary equivalent. Then and now, we look at them blind. We guess. We discuss. We decide which one. Well, individually, we decide which one is then, which one is now. We mark them out of 10. And I tell you, we've never been wrong between then and now, and then has always scored higher. And that's a rather sad comment, but and there's no doubt at all that the whiskey that's being made now is far more consistent. It's still extremely good, but it lacks something that those whiskies made in the 60s and 70s, certainly in terms of Scotch. I don't know about bourbon and rye, but it lacks some sort of, usually quite a grubby sort of character, dirty character, which gives character. I mean, whiskies tend to be cleaner and purer now than they were then, and because of course they're all made for blending. It'd be very, very interesting actually to take this on to another area. The proliferation of new distilleries, both in the US and here, and indeed all over the world. Do you know whiskey is now being made in 82 countries around the world? It's unbelievable. And but anyway, these little distilleries, and some of them not so little, of course, but they can create a style because they're going to have sell it on its own merit. So they're exploring yeasts, they're exploring barley varieties in terms of Scotch malt, longer fermentations, all stuff, because at the end of the day, the product itself must stand on its own merits. It's not being used for blending, and this is very interesting. How many of them will survive remains to be seen, but it's a glorious ambition to. It's like bartenders. I've got great admiration for bartenders and to create products that have an interesting and perhaps unusual flavor. It's all flavor driven now, rather than putting into blends and mixing the flavors up. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Mike, let's ask the corollary here. Are bourbons today better than they were in the 60s and 70s? You've tasted a lot of bourbons from back in the day and modern day stuff. Are we making better bourbon now than we did 30, 40 years ago?
It depends on your taste. Older stuff was better for my taste. I like a little heavier. I like that older flavor that you get. There's been a lot of things that changed. Like I said, hybrid grains weren't even around until after the war is when hybrid grains started being grown. Hybrid corns and such. That's going to change the flavor. You got the change in the barrel entry proof in 1964. That's going to change the flavor. You got changes in water supplies as more and more distilleries quit using groundwater and started using reverse osmosis water. There's just a lot of different things, subtle things that have changed. Better equipment, better understanding of the equipment, allowing them to make a cleaner whiskey. Sometimes those interesting flavors comes because somebody didn't quite get the cypress vat cleaned enough when they were going to ferment the next time, and there's a little bacteria growth that created the interesting flavor. There's different things like that's going to happen that's going to change the flavor of whiskey, from back then to today. Technically, they're making better whiskey today than they ever did. But at the same time, I find a lot of the big distilleries' whiskeys are getting closer and closer in flavor profile. And, it's getting to be, it's hard to tell the difference between Distillery A and Distillery B's bourbon when they're both 4 years old, made from about the same mash bill, distilled off and put into the barrel at 125 proof and aged for 4 years and bottled at 80 proof. There you go, It's harder and harder to tell different distilleries' products apart because of that. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's happening in Scotland as well, but that's what's happening here in the United States.
We have a great comment here from Dan Wooley. Hello, gents. Question for Charlie from his personal security guard in Australia. Has isolation locked down you to drink more whiskey than usual? And is that actually even possible? And Dan's one of our buddies from Australia. I can hear the story about being a security guard.
Dan. Oh, God bless you. Forced him to drink more whiskey than usual. Well, actually, yes. Well, the answer, Dan, is probably yes. I've had a very good lot in the sense that my routine is that I rise early. I rise at 6:30 in the morning. I go for a stroll around a nearby private park for, let's say, about 3/4 of an hour. I come back and shit, shave and shower, and then hit my desk by 7:30. I'm better in the mornings. And then as Mark remarked, I mean, I have a number of commissions to write, which turned out to be an absolute bloody godsend because the so I had a lot of sort of delightful sort of historical research in the mornings. I have a glass of dry sherry at 11 o'clock. And if I'm doing any tastings, because interspersed with this, I've had a lot of tastings to do, tasting notes, which I do at about 11 o'clock. So I dispense with the sherry and go straight into the whiskey. Although I don't know about you, I found that if I'm writing, detailed tasting notes, I can really only do 2, possibly 3 before. If you're writing very detailed notes, before it becomes your palate becomes cloudy. I suppose you can if you were to rest for half an hour or so, you can go back to them. But by that time, because obviously I'm not spitting, I'm tasting and drinking enthusiastically mostly, and so then I have a gin at midday, and then I potter away, and then I have a light lunch, and then I read in the afternoon, and then I read and nap. Actually, don't tell anybody about this, but I now have a siesta. Never did it before in my life, but I rather like a siesta now in the afternoon for an hour, and then I go back to work, and then I'll work through into the evening, and then pack up about. Well, then I have my first proper dram at 6 o'clock, and then I'll have several. And then I go to bed early, go to bed 9:30. So you're picking me up, Mark. You see, I shouldn't be here. I should be in my bed. But Dan, how are you, man? Dan Wooley is a legend in Australia, and the bartender, bar owner, whiskey expert, and I'm so delighted that he's online. God bless you. Hey, good man.
Yeah, Dan created the Highwayman line of single malts from Australia earlier this year, and I can't wait to try them because he didn't have them available when I was down there last summer, but I can't wait to try those whiskeys. Mike, maybe you know this question. Maybe Charlie, you know this one from our pal Billy Abbott in London at the Whiskey Exchange. Do either of you know when bourbon casks were first used to mature Scotch whiskey? Who got the idea to get these bourbon casks over? Do you know this?
I know exactly what this is. Where this is.
Over to you, Mike. Yep. Do you know that?
World War II. Scotland all of a sudden had a lot of trouble getting casks from the continent because of Hitler didn't particularly want them to get it. So in America at the same time, they had just passed the regulation saying straight whiskey had to be in a brand new cask. So we had a hell of a lot of old bourbon casks and rye casks, laying around. So during World War II, they shipped the barrels over to Scotland so that they could make Scotch whiskey because they needed the Scotch whiskey to be made to basically pay their war debt to the United States. That was the one profitable product that Britain was selling to the United States, earning a lot of American dollars to pay off their war debts. So
Charlie, what do you know about that end?
Yeah, I think now, Mike, am I right in thinking that the Coopers Unions in the 1930s, I thought 1936 to be precise, but I stand corrected, broke a deal with the American distillers that to call the product straight bourbon or straight rye, it had to be filled into brand new oak casks.
Well,
or were they all filling into oak casks? I mean, they were all filling into oak, but
it wasn't so much the unions. It wasn't so much the unions, it was the politicians. There was a politician from Arkansas, Wilbur Mills. You all might remember him later for the 1970 sex scandal. But he's the one that put the regulation in to get brand new barrels. And that was because Arkansas was a huge source of oak and had lots of cooperages, and it was a jobs bill. In the middle of a depression, it was creating jobs. But with that said, there was a tradition already that the best straight whiskey came from brand new barrels. And that during the 19th century, whiskey was sold by the barrel to the tavern or the liquor store or whatever, and people came in and got their flask or their bottle filled right out of the barrel. If you're a distiller, E.H. Taylor Jr., if his OFC distillery in the 1870s, he sells 100 barrels of whiskey to somebody in St. Louis, he's not getting those barrels back. So if he wants to make another 100 barrels, he's going to have to buy another 100 barrels. Now,
Yeah,
there were used barrels amongst that, but the majority of them were brand new, and it quickly became known that the best, straight bourbon or rye came out of those brand new charred barrels. So there was a precedent, a reason, a taste reason why the industry was happy to go with that regulation when Wilbur Mills put it up before Congress.
Yeah, that's very interesting indeed. To answer your question directly, Billy, according to the Speyside Cooperage that I've spoken to, they never saw bourbon barrels before 1946. And so it was really, and you can imagine that, post-Prohibition, they were all being used up, but then but by 1946, there was a surplus of used American barrels, which were going cheap. Now, the Scotch whisky industry they favored American oak, but American oak ex-sherry. The transport casks that were used for, they're much favored by the Scotch whisky industry, were sherry transport casks, shall I say, were made from American oak, made from white oak, not from European oak. And the whole idea of when we loosely refer to ex-bourbon, ex-sherry, we shouldn't be referring to that. We should be referring to American oak and European oak. Nowadays, ex-sherry tends to be, but not always. Look at MacLean, synonymous with European oak, and European oak gives an entirely different flavor. But the transport casks, they were so favoured in the right up until before the war, were sherry seasoned American white oak casks, butts, principally. Now, even in the 1890s, the demand for the amount of sherry that was being drunk did not supply sufficient casks during that burgeoning period of the 1890s in Scotch whisky. And so, of course, we had William Lowry in Glasgow, but he claimed to be the pioneer of sherry seasoning. And so these casks were being raised in Scotland and then seasoned with sherry or also with Paxaret, which has now been banned, but it's very heavily sweetened. Vin de couleur, the very heavy sweet thing. So the straight answer is that the American barrels really only started to come in a big way after the war. And then they were remade into hogsheads because hogsheads was the sort of standard size that the Scotch industry used because of simply for manhandling. When you're rolling a little barrel like that, you get terrible backache. And so they were, what was it, sort of four barrels to 3 hogsheads or something like that. You'd knock them down, put new hoops on, and rebuild them. So they went from 200 litres to 250 litres. And that has been the way ever since. And so now, of course, there are increasingly some companies are using filling barrels, 200 American ASBs, American standard barrels, because they have a slightly quicker maturation. But it's a very interesting thing. But there's a confusion there in the public mind, and indeed in the general perception, the promotion of Scotch, that the ex-sherry is good, but they don't say whether it's ex-sherry American or ex-sherry European. You know? And it makes a big difference. I think ex-sherry American is probably the best style of barrel to mature in. That's my own opinion.
Here's a more interesting twist on that question: is when did the Scotch whiskey industry start using American oak? Because what a lot of people don't realize that even before the Second World War, a lot of American oak was being sent to Europe to be turned into barrels to put things like port and sherry and such, because they could buy American oak cheaper than they could buy Spanish oak or French oak or something like that.
Absolutely, Mike. Absolutely. There's a massive amount of American oak coming from, and I mean, either before it was even staved, you know, to Spain particularly, but also to Scotland after the 1890s to be made into barrels here. Because as I say, I mean, obviously you can grow American oak trees in Spain, in Europe, but there wasn't enough to supply the demand for particularly in the bodegas. The bodega casks are American oak. You know, the use of European oak European oak was used extensively for brewing, and a lot of it, certainly the stuff that came from the UK, came from from the Baltic, and so it came from Poland and Russia, and what was called the Memel oak, and the port of Memel, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's on the Baltic, and that was very highly regarded by brewers. Whether it was so highly regarded still is, I don't know, isn't there? But so that was European oak. So European oak was used particularly for brewing, but you're absolutely right. There was a big export of American oak to Spain, and indeed, that trade was. Well, my friend Gavin Smith believes that trade was interrupted by the Spanish Civil War, and so even before 1946, so in the 1930s, the trade of the shipping of American oak to Spain for transport casks, and indeed for bodega casks, was interrupted, and that also helped. So there may have been some trickled through to Scotland. I don't know about that. All I know is that there's one cooperage, and I imagine that's a good example of Speyside cooperage. They never saw American barrels until 1946, after 1946. But it is a very interesting thing, and when we're thinking about what whiskey tasted like in the old days, well, let's say pre-war, and you're talking about mainly sherry matured, so-called sherry matured, but you're talking about transport casks, you're talking about American oak transport casks. Well, I was doing some writing for Gordon and MacPhail, and I was told that they have evidence that the casks coming to them, the transport casks, the sherry transport casks, were American oak until the 1960s, and there was no precise date. They dealt a lot with Williams and Humbert sherry shippers, and it's probably it varied from shipper to shipper, but then they for some reason they switched over to European oak. It may have been something to do with price, but then of course, European oak is you get far fewer casks out of a tree than you do with American oak, because in American oak grows beautifully long and thin, and so it is something. It is a mystery. It's a mystery to me, and I would welcome. But it's very interesting to look at you look at all the records of sherry shipments and how the sherry went through to the UK, went through fashions. So at certain periods in the 1860s, let's say, there was or 60s, 70s, it was very popular. Then, fun enough, it grew in the 30s and 40s sherry, but by that time, American casks, And I think that the Scotch whisky industry realised that you could get well, again, from the blender's perspective, you got a more consistent product out of an American oak ex-bourbon cask, because the bourbon didn't influence the flavour of the Scotch spirit to the same extent as the sherry does, and so for consistency reasons they favoured, and so nowadays I would guess that probably, well, the last figure I heard was 90% of the new casks that are coming into that's to say the casks coming into the system are American. 90% are ex-bourbon casks, and only 10% ex-sherry. And all the ex-sherry will be made to order, you know, and some of them will be European and some of them will be American.
Charlie, I want to go back for a second where you were talking about the use of American oak for transport casks for sherry, because I remember a few years ago we were together at Edinburgh Castle when Gordon and MacPhail unveiled the Glenlivet 70-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
That was in a Williams and Humbert sherry cask. Was that American oak? Because I didn't realize that at the time.
They didn't know. I guess it was.
Wow.
I wrote the tasting notes, and I'm certain it was American oak because it had these lovely characteristics of, but they didn't know, because again the assumption is that oh God, I'm running out of battery. Hang on, I'll leave you for a second. I'm just going to get my cable to keep the battery going on my phone. Excuse me.
Okay. Mike, let's. What do you got in your? You still have the old 55 in your glass?
No, I was drinking some of the stuff that Bill Thomas and
right.
contracted.
So when is that actually going to hit
Really
hit a bottle for where we might actually be able to try it?
You'll have to talk to Bill on that, because basically it's all going to go into the bottle and be sold through Jack Rowe's Dining Saloon. So yeah, we got 4 barrels of it. Some really good stuff. I'll tell you, I'm still getting a really nice chocolate finish here on this whiskey, you know, and even not quite 2 years old. This is good.
I remember tasting that with you last spring when we were out to talk for the Heaven Hill podcast.
Yeah.
You poured some of that for me back when an earlier sample of that, and I can't wait to try it again.
Oh yeah. Well, next time you're in Louisville, you know where I live.
I know exactly where you live, and I'll be over there. Charlie, we had a question for you about, first of all, Dave Kuhn said he loved watching you in The Angel's Share and the Ken Loach film that came out in 2012, and wanted to know if you'd had any interesting celebrity experiences with celebrities who wanted to pick your brain about whiskey. Charlie, can you hear me?
Who are you addressing, Mark?
Charlie, we're you.
I can't hear you.
Dave Kuhn had the question. He was he enjoyed watching you in The Angel's Share and wanted to know if you had fun making that movie, but also if you had any interesting experiences with celebrities who wanted to pick your brain about Scotch whiskey at the time.
Celebrities that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, what was the question? I'm flattered that he enjoyed seeing me in The Angel's Share. What was his question, though?
His question was whether you'd had any interesting experiences with celebrities who wanted to pick your brain about Scotch whiskey when they met you. And Mike will ask you the same question in a second here.
Well, I'm sorry. It's very broken up. I can't really hear you terribly well.
Okay.
But I'm delighted that you enjoyed that eager performance in The Angel's Share, which was, of course, where I was just playing myself. And what was the question about it?
He wanted to know, Charlie. He wanted to know if you've ever had any experiences with celebrities, actors, other famous people who recognized your expertise in Scotch whiskey and spent all the time picking your brain about whiskeys.
if I've ever had experience with celebrities who are interested in whiskey, what?
Yes. Where people wanted to know what you thought and were trying to get your information. Where they treated you as you were the celebrity rather than the actor or whatever. I think he heard it that.
Oh man, I've nothing to do with the Angel Share, but in the last since 2006, I've been doing a lot of work in China and particularly earlier on in Taiwan, and in China I'm just called the master, you know, and then from time to time I have been in India, not nearly so much as in China, but in India they just call me the guru. So I mean, that's, if you like, celebrity. It's honorific and completely undeserved, but nevertheless and in Scotland, the Scots don't believe in any kind of sort of honouring anybody, quite frankly. But over the years since the Angel Share was released, and still current still this year, walking down the street and someone say, "I recognise you," you know. What? How do I recognise you? And then usually they look a bit like Dan Wooley, you know. They've got shaven heads and tattoos and piercings and so on, and so it's scary sort of creatures. And and I say, did you ever see that film called The Angel Share? Fucking hell, man! Yeah, you're the guy in The Angel Share. Great. I went to see it twice. Said took my wife the second time. I mean, it's so heartwarming because it appeals to. I mean, I've had bishops and judges and right down to low life, going saying I really enjoyed that film. People you would not imagine could even understand it, and I mean, and let alone, so that's in Scotland, but it did phenomenally well in France. It did very well in Germany. In Germany, I was dubbed, and apparently I was dubbed with a funny squeaky voice, but I never heard it. But it was sort of global celebrity for a moment, But I think it's probably my moustache. It's so recognizable, That's why people recognize it.
Mike, do you ever have any celebrities that you've done tastings for that wanted to pick your brain about bourbon?
Not that I can think of. I don't know if I've hung around with that many celebrities, but I do occasionally get people recognize me because of my part in one of the documentaries out there, Bourbon Kentucky or Neat or something like that. But it happens. I get a lot of people asking me my opinions when they recognize me.
Hey, what are you up to these days? I know the Oxmoor Farm bourbon salons are canceled for the year, but you're doing some virtual tastings, Mike. Tell us about those.
Order to raise money for Oxmoor Farm because they still need a lot of money. When you've got a very old house that size, it takes a lot of money to upkeep it. So I'm working with Susan Riegler and Shirley Harmon to do virtual bourbon tastings, and we're opening up a bottle out of the Tom Bullitt wine cellar. When I say Tom Bullitt, this is Tom Bullitt as in Bullitt County, not the Bourbon Bullitt. Tom Bullitt was a lawyer for the Kentucky Warehousing Association and has a lot of whiskey given to him over. So, for example, this next one that we're doing, I think on the 23rd or 26th, we're opening up a bottle of Old Granddad from the 1960s, and because it's an 86 proof, we thought we'd try a couple of modern 86 proofs and along with it and see, how it fares with the comparison. So yeah, it's $50 a ticket. Susan's putting the samples together. You buy the ticket. I think you have to buy the ticket like 3 or 4 days before the actual event, so she can get the samples to you. But then we'll do a virtual tasting.
And we'll add a link on our social media feeds to find out more about that. Charlie, I know you've been writing a lot during the lockdown. 4 different books on various commissions? What are you working on these days?
Well, I have been extremely fortunate in the sense that I was commissioned to write a big book with the meretricious title "History of Whiskey in 100 Objects" early last year, and I owe the last three so much, including last year. I think I was abroad a great deal. I know for example that between the 1st of August last year and the 31st of October, 92 days, I spent 20 nights in my own bed. Far too much travel. And so, although I'd agreed to do this book early last year, I had done absolutely nothing about it by the middle of the year. And I said to the publisher, look, I can't do this. Get somebody else to take it on. And I suggested Gavin Smith, because he's a very good writer and he's a good friend and so on. And oh no, they said, oh, we've got to have you on the cover as well. But then they said, would you prefer to work with Gavin and do the book together? And I said, absolutely delighted. And we'll give you another year to deliver. And so I mean, couldn't turn it down. But of course, it's turned out to be a godsend, because I started on it just after the turn of the year, and both we finished it by about a fortnight ago, and so our delivery date was the end of August, but we finished by the end of June, and well before the end of June. So that was great fun, and it was great fun actually doing this historical research, and but then another couple of smaller books to accompany eye-wateringly expensive bottles of whiskey in their packs. One was a Kurosawa, one was a 1948 Glen Grant. Again, historical research, good fun, and then the fourth one was actually it was an update and of a book, my book Malt Whisky, which I was researching 25 years ago now actually, and I had to look at the whole text, which I'm sure Mike, is difficult. Things that you've written so long ago. Mercifully there were no absolute howlers, because one's learning all the time. But I had to go through that and then bring it up to date, because it was finished in 95, and so to bring it up to date. That was for an American thing. I think, are you not on that, either of you, Mark or Mike, what do they call it, the Whiskey Masters program, Joey Kindman's, and they offer diplomas in whiskey stuff, and this book was actually the set text for Scotch Malt Whisky, but they couldn't get actually hard copies, and but so I kind of readjusted the text and expanded it for the course. So, and then there's usually a steady stream of tastings to do. I'm just analytical tastings, and of course the other thing now, of course, is that these Zoom calls, which I can't really cope with because I'm not up with the technology, but the people like So I've been doing a number of corporate Zooms, tasting whiskies and chatting about it and so on. So my days have been fruitfully filled until till 2 days ago, when the last 2 days have been a complete void. Well, I had this work signing these bloody labels this afternoon, but so I'm looking forward to putting my feet up this weekend for the first time in well, as long as I can remember, actually.
We have one final question from Dave Kuhn. What historical anecdote about whiskey puts a smile on your face or still astonishes you every time you think about it? Do you have a favorite whiskey anecdote that you still just can't quite believe the way it happened or the way it worked? Charlie's cracking laughing here, so I want to go with you, Charlie, first.
I can't think of any. Oh, it's like being asked to tell a joke. God, I don't know. No, I can't remember. I mean, I think that I think if you look into the career of Tommy Dewar, you come upon Billy's coming back. No, if you look into the stories about Tommy Dewar, who's a very witty man, and there were so many stories, and he was a terrific self-publicist and publicist for his brand, for Dewar's whiskey. And the one that always makes me smile is when he was at a very posh. He came from Perthshire, and so he was a lad from the Glens, if you like, but went down to London, did extraordinarily well. Obviously finished as a baronet. Oh no, a baron. I mean, not a baronet. But but there was on one occasion he was sitting at a posh dinner table by this rather snooty woman, and she said to him, "My name is Porter with a hyphen," to which Tommy replied, "And mine's Dewar with a siphon," because of course they all used, so it was all scooch with the soda water in those days. That's a rather trivial sort of example. Mike, can you think of any? I'm sure you can think of. It needs more drams and more consideration. Good. It's a very good question, and oh dear, that's silly. Well, my last dram is a Lagavulin. Can you see it? No, you can't. Same thing. Cask of distinction. Lagavulin. What is it? 94.
Yep, that looks like a Lagavulin 94 to me.
Again, strength not declared, but it's just cask strength. It's very useful, actually, Mark, being able to tie in these little bottles. I keep them for special occasions.
Yes.
With friends, but there's well, and that looks like a reasonable dram. It is a reasonable dram, but it's really only enough for two. Do you know what I mean? So I can't share it with a group of friends.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be able to guzzle it myself. Sounds very, very mild, very, very mild.
Billy Abbott says he hopes you're not breaking non-disclosure agreements, Charlie. And Dave officially jealous now. Mike, you got a great whiskey story, a great whiskey anecdote that you still smile about?
The one that I like the best is, supposedly this is a true story. It's about the bartender at the Pendennis Club. There used to be a local politician that would come in to the Pendennis Club for lunch a couple times a week, and he'd go up to the bartender and say, "Give me the usual." And the bartender would look around to see which distiller was in the bar and pour that distiller's bourbon. So he comes in one day and he says, "Give me the usual," and the bartender pulls out and gives him a gin and tonic. And before the politician could say anything, the bartender pulls him closer and says, "They're all here."
They're all here. Yeah, that works for me.
Yeah.
Those guys are the guys like the Pendennis Club and the Sealbach, the bar in the basement that used to be the Speakeasy or whatever. Those guys must have had it rough back in the day, because everybody would all the distillers would hang out there.
Right, particularly the Pendennis Club, all the Louisville distillers in particular. But Louisville was the center of the bourbon industry. Even if you had a distillery out in Bardstown or Lexington or something, you generally had an office here in Louisville because of the city transportation in the 19th century. So all the distillers from all over the state would be down at the Pendennis Club.
And Greg Serafian in Paris, Greg's whiskey guy, says he didn't get the joke. They served the gin and tonic because all the master distillers were in there and they didn't want to play favorites. So I hope that explains it really well. Dave Kuhn explains that as well. And Greg also says he loves Dewerisms. Tommy Dewar had some great lines. Do you have one more that you remember offhand, Charlie?
I'm sorry.
Do you have one more Tommy Dewar saying that you remember offhand, besides the only thing you get in a hurry is trouble?
Mark, I'm sorry. The whole thing's been very, very broken up.
Okay.
Can you tell me again? Can you ask me again?
Greg Serafian in Paris says he loves the Tommy Dewar sayings, and he loves the one at the warehouse door that says the only thing you get in a hurry is trouble. Do you remember any other good Dewerisms off the top of your head to send us out?
Yeah, I remember. I see Greg's text down at the bottom here. Oh gosh, I don't remember the one at the warehouse door. The only thing you get in a hurry is whiskey. Is trouble. That's right. The only thing you get in a hurry. He said, and of course, things like age is particularly venerated, especially when it's in a bottle. But he was a terrific man for marketing. Look after advertising, and advertising will look after you. There's a whole book of them. They were called Dewerisms, and he was such a soft publicist that he made sure that the press were always informed about these witticisms, these aphorisms, and some of which are still very pertinent today. I mean, they haven't dated. I mean, he must have been a terrific character, Tommy Dewar, I must say. What other things? Yes. Minds are like parachutes. They only operate when they're open. Isn't that?
And with that, guys, we've gone over an hour and a half, and we probably could have gone easily another half hour here with all the questions and comments. But Charlie MacLean, Mike Veach, two of the greats when it comes to whiskey history on the Scotch and the bourbon side. Gentlemen, thank you for spending the last hour and a half or so with us and answering all the questions. Guys, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Let me say...
Honored.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Bye.
One at a time, guys. Go ahead, Mike, since Charlie's drinking.
I said, thanks for having me. Be glad to do it again.
And Charlie, any final comments?
I'm sorry?
Any final comments, Charlie? We're gonna call it a night now.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Really, I've enjoyed it very much. We'll do it again, Mark.
We'll definitely do this again on another future webcast. Let me say goodbye to everyone here. Guys, I want to thank you for for joining us for the Happy Hour webcast tonight. We are going to have a lot of fun coming up this coming week. We've already sort of given you a hint of what we're going to have on Wednesday night on the Whiskey Wednesday webcast when I mentioned that I was tasting the Shiner Bock, or the Texas Bock whiskey from Balcones. Jared Hempstead, the head distiller at Balcones Distillery, don't call him the master distiller, will be joining us. They have a brand new whiskey coming out that we're going to debut on the Wednesday webcast this week. We'll also have Jackie Zykan from Old Forester. She is the master taster and helped pick the barrels for this year's Old Forester birthday bourbon. And then next Friday on the Happy Hour webcast, we have Nino Kilgore Marchetti rather, from the Whiskey Wash, and our pal Clay Risen from the New York Times, who has also written a bunch of great whiskey books on the side and has a whiskey book coming out this fall. We will also have the WhiskyCast podcast coming up this weekend, and I want to thank you all for joining us. Slancheva, stay safe, wear a mask when you're out in public, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, everyone. Good night.